String bending is an essential part of blues, and in this video we're going to look at small bends, big bends, bends over two strings, basically all the bending techniques you need to be a great blues player. So let's start by looking at the two most important bends to help us find the blues sound. Because with blues, it's not just about playing the notes as written, but finding those slightly out of tune in between notes which really give the blues feel. Now the track you heard in the intro was in the key of G major, and everything I'm about to show you here will be based around the G minor pentatonic here at the 3rd fret. Now of course you can move all of this up to the 15th fret as well if you wanted. Now there'll be a couple of notes outside of that pentatonic scale, but I'll explain how they fit in as we go through. So both of these first two bends are on the G string, and let's start with this one at the 5th fret. Now this is a really important bend for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if we bend this note up a full step, by full step I mean the equivalent of going to the note 2 frets higher. So hear this note at the 7th fret, that's the pitch we're aiming for. Now this note is actually the next note in our pentatonic scale, so the same as 3rd fret on the B string here. So just imagine in a solo, instead of playing this note just like that, plain and boring, we can bend up to it from there, and that has a lot more blues in it. Now what you want to experiment with is going a lot slower than you might think on this bend, and just listening for how you find some blues feel along the way. That kind of thing. The other reason why bending on this note is so important is because give it a half step bend up, and by half step I mean going to the note equivalent of 1 fret higher. So here at the 6th fret, this is the note we're aiming for. Now this note here at the 6th fret, this D flat, this is what we call the blue note, and when we add it to the pentatonic scale it becomes the blues scale. So just by making this half step bend up, we instantly get the blues scale, which is instant blues feel. With this half step bend, I find it works really well to pre-bend up and then let it come down after you've picked it. So maybe practice going up the full step bend and then down the half step bend like that. Then the other note we can bend on the G string is of course at the 3rd fret. And what we want to do with this is play what we call a microtonal bend, where we're not aiming for another note, we're just pushing it slightly sharp. And I find the best way to play this type of bend is let it sound at its original pitch first, and then push up slightly just before you move on to the next note. It can be quite subtle, but adds a lot of blues feeling to your playing. Because what's going on here, we're playing over G major, which has this major 3rd of B in it. So when we play this B flat note from the pentatonic, it can grind against that quite a lot, but just this slight push sharp makes it more palatable in that context. And of course this movement, the fact that the note's not just staying still, it's kind of playing in the listener's ear with this idea that is it out of tune, is it in tune, and that's where a lot of the blues feel comes from. This microtonal bend also works at the 6th fret on the high E string, where we get the same note an octave higher. Now these two bends on the G string blend together really well in licks like that. And then it's really on you as to how fast, how slow, how sharp, how flat you play them, as to how you extract that emotional blues feeling from them. Secondly then, let's look at a technique I call bend and repeat. So we're at the 6th fret on the B string here, and we want to be able to bend this note up a full step. Now I should say, this is a really important bend in its own right. because this takes us from our minor seventh of F up to our root note of G, and having this big bend up to the root note has loads and loads of uses. In particular, it's a great place to end phrases, because coming back to that root note, it's always going to sound like that phrase belongs. But anyway, back to this technique of bend and repeat. So when we bend up this note a full step, you'll find we've got this same note, the root note of G, here at the 3rd fret on the high E. So we can bend up and then play the same note then on the high E string. And this works really well in a blues setting. Then we could do the same thing on the G and B strings together. But of course, we're bending at the 5th fret on that G string as we saw earlier. Now this is where all those Johnny Be Good, Chuck Berry style licks come from. And the other thing that works really well is if we play both strings together with that bend. So we've got the same note twice, but on the lower string, we're bending up to it, which gives this cool kind of out of phase sound. So I could play a bend and repeat and then both together, something like that might work. Same on the G and B strings. On to number 3, and let's look at how we can play a series of cascading half-step bends. So we saw earlier that we can play the half-step bend from the 5th fret on the G string, but we can also play it from the 5th fret on the B string and the 5th fret on the high E. Now this is really useful because not only is this easy to remember that we've got these 3 bends in the same place on these 3 strings, but it introduces some much more sophisticated sounding notes. So if you're thinking these notes at the 5th fret of the B and high E strings don't belong to our G minor pentatonic scale, then of course you're right. And in this situation, we could probably best describe them as being from the G Dorian scale, which is a much more sophisticated sound. But as we're playing them as a half-step bend, we're immediately bending up to a note from our pentatonic scale. So we get this flicker of the more sophisticated sound, but then bending up into something more familiar. Then of course on the G string, that half step bend is into our blue note, which gives us that dark blues flavour. Now you can of course use any of these 3 bends independently, but they also work really well when you put them back to back. One little extra thing I like to do when I'm playing these half-step bends is combine them with a sting on the note at the fret above, like this. So I'm making the half-step bend up, and then slide to the fret above, which is the same note as we bent to, and then quickly sliding back down again to the original fret. It's a bit tricky at first, but if you can get it, it really adds something extra. Number 4, and let's look at double stop bends where we play 2 strings at once. Now, a good place to start with this is 5th fret on the B string. Just as we saw in the last segment, we'll bend this up half a step, but we're also going to play 6th fret on the high E at the same time. So this moves us from this super crunchy tritone sound to the bend up, where these become a perfect 5th, equivalent to both notes of the 6th fret. But of course, in the context of our G major, this gives us a flat 7 and a flat 3rd, which is a very crunchy sound in its own right. So altogether, this is a super crunchy blues sound. And then what you can see me doing there is exactly the same frets 5 and 6, but on the G and B strings. Now this time, with this note on the G string, just like we saw earlier in the video, you can either go a full step up on it, or the half step, and it's really for you to manage how much crunch you want out of that. Gives you sounds like that. Lastly, number 5, 1.5 step bends. So a 1.5 step bend is the equivalent of going to the note 3 frets higher. So what you saw me doing there was bending this G at the 8th fret up to this B flat, same as at the 11th fret. It's quite a big bend and it's quite challenging. You'll need to practice this and build up the strength in your fingers. Now there's a couple of places in our pentatonic scale where the notes are 3 frets apart. Firstly here on the high E, we've got the 3rd and 6th frets. Now it's virtually impossible for me to play that huge bend on that position on the high E. Hence why I was moving up to the 8th fret here where I get that same note, so the G is the same note here, and I'm bending up to here, which is the same as here. So I'm just using those same notes in a different position to make the bend possible. Then the other place where we've got this 3-note gap on the B string, 3rd and 6th frets again. Now in this position, on the B string, can just about make it. It's slightly harder down at that end of the guitar, but it is doable there. It will take some practice though. But once you've got these big bends, it really makes those notes stand out. Like that kind of thing. So I hope that was useful. Do check the link below if you want the tab and backing track. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.